Spanning 2 decades, the Vietnam War inflicted horrific suffering on the nation's people, claiming the lives of 3 million Vietnamese civilians and soldiers and the deaths of 58,000 American troops. But after so many years of conflict, when it came, the end was swift. The chaotic evacuation of Saigon, as North Vietnamese forces descended on the city, marked the last chapter in a crushing defeat for America. The dramatic scenes were filmed by ITN camera crews in the city as they joined the race to escape.
The Marines inside all had their guns pointed at me, saying, "Put that camera down, otherwise we'll shoot you."
Those left behind witnessed the triumphant arrival of Vietnam's new communist rulers.
This is a historic moment, the arrival of the North Vietnamese Regular Army in Saigon.
50 years on from the fall of Saigon, this is the story of how ITN captured a defining moment in history. The Vietnam War is often referred to as the first televised war. During the 1960s and 70s, the combination of new technologies and relatively unrestricted access to the front lines allowed journalists to bring the story into people's homes like never before.
Patrols like these in the Mekong Delta are convinced that they're winning their war against the VC.
They've contacted about 2 platoons of Viet Cong, probably North Vietnamese soldiers.
And so Saigon burns. Already half the city, a great part of the city has been destroyed.
By 1975, it was clear the situation was changing rapidly. Following the signing of the Paris Peace Accords in 1973, the final American troops were withdrawn from combat and financial support to southern Vietnam was drastically cut. Emboldened, the North Vietnamese launched a major offensive in the spring of 1975, which would take them all the way to Saigon.
The difficult question was when to send. And when a big thing happened, the Tet Offensive in 1968, for example, you had to be there. And then by 1975, it was becoming very clear that the end was in sight.
In terms of how quickly events took place that brought about the fall of Saigon, it really began, I would say, about mid-March of 1975, in which communist offensive really took hold in terms of the fall of pivotal cities in the Central Highlands, and then leading southwards until the tanks arrived in Saigon. And so, I think what was quite clear regarding the end of April 1975 was that the Saigonese, those who were living in the city, as well as elsewhere in South Vietnam, knew that the end was near.
At the time, ITN had 2 news crews in Vietnam. Correspondent Sandy Gall was teamed up with a French agency team comprised of Jacques Chaudenson and Lucien Boutras. Michael Nicholson was working alongside sound recordist Hugh Thompson and cameraman Peter Wilkinson.
It was my first trip to Vietnam, and I went out early March in '75. The first incident I filmed was a US cargo plane came down just outside of Saigon with 350 people on it, mostly babies and orphans being taken back to the United States. And that came down in a paddy field. It was just horrendous. And I thought, my God, this is what it's like. This is a real war.
As the end became more and more clear and close, the question then arose, who should stay, should they stay, or should they come out? And I remember having agonized discussions with the editor, who was Nigel Ryan at the time. And we sent them a message saying, you must leave. You must leave when the time comes and the war is clearly over and the North Vietnamese are clearly coming. you must leave. To which we got a really angry reply from Nicholson, who said, listen, you guys are just covering your asses. The decision will be taken here by us, according to the circumstances.
On April the 28th, 1975, with the Viet Cong advancing towards Saigon, a fierce battle broke out for control of Newport Bridge on the outskirts of the city. Throughout the day, ITN's teams witnessed the intense battle unfold.
The fight for Newport Bridge, only 2 miles out of Saigon, was the bloodiest we've seen. Early Monday morning, a Viet Cong sapper unit, probably no more than 20 or 30 men and women, attacked and set fire to an American newsaid installation, closing the bridge and Highway 1. Thousands of troops and refugees were trapped on the other side of them, unable to reach the safety of the capital. Again and again, this company of South Vietnamese troops worked their way down the far side of the bridge, and again they were mortared, taking many casualties, leaving many dead. The troops are now moving down on the other side of Newport Bridge. There's AK fire coming in from the factory. But now they've crossed the hump of the bridge, it means they're advancing anyway. We still don't know how many there are down there. We thought about 12 earlier today. An armored car's going up on the left. There's no way of shifting these people. There must be, 500 or 600 troops on this bridge, fighting probably a dozen or so, maybe 20 at the most, communists, and yet there they are, they've been there all today. The firefight lasted another 2 hours, but because of our open position on the bridge, there was no way we ourselves could get out. But a final charge and a last volley of hand grenades, and the fight to reopen Newport Bridge on Highway 1 was over. So the battle for Newport Bridge ends this evening, back in South Vietnamese hands. And a half an hour ago, these men were told that they had a new president. President Minh installed in the presidential palace, the man who they hope, we hope, will bring peace to this country.
The situation escalated quickly, and efforts to secure Newport Bridge were ultimately in vain. The next day, the Americans used an Irving Berlin song to signal the start of Operation Frequent Wind, the final evacuation from Saigon.
When White Christmas played on the airwaves, it was a signal to the United States and to the remaining Americans to get to their appointed, agreed upon evacuation sites. White Christmas meant for the South Vietnamese that the Americans were going to leave. And so if families had planned for the end, they knew to really enact their escape plans.
Everyone was terrified. Everybody wanted to get out, leave Vietnam. We heard White Christmas. It was about 3 in the morning. Went down to the foyer. We all met up, and then off we go. We were going to be picked up at a bus, almost a bus stop near the hotel, and there were hundreds of people there, queuing. Eventually, we got on the last one together, and we were sitting in the front seats, and it was horrendous. As we were driving around the streets, the bumper caught on a roll of barbed wire, which they would pull across to close the road, basically. You got it in the back bumper. We were driving down the streets with people attached in the barbed wire. It was horrendous. And every time we stopped, there was a chap on the door, a very tough chap with a shotgun. And when people put their fingers in the doors to try and open the doors, he would hit them, and some of them went under the bus. It was awful. It was awful. And eventually we were taken to the American embassy, where there were thousands of people. They'd been there for days. We were trying to make our way to the front of the queue to get, I could see we had to climb over the wall, helped by Marines who were amazing. A young girl she tried to pass the baby to me. She said, "Please take my baby for me, because he won't stand a chance here." And I said, "I can't." We tried to climb the wall, and our feet were covered in excrement and urine because these people had been there for days. So trying to climb over a wall, well, it was just so difficult. And eventually they pulled me over, and I squatted down on top of the roof of this entrance building and started filming Hugh Thompson, that's my sound man, and Michael Nicholson. And the Marines inside all had their guns pointed at me, saying, "Put that camera down, otherwise we'll shoot you." And I actually thought, I'm not going to make it out of this place anyway, so I might, and I filmed it.
If it wasn't for one single American Marine whose name I didn't have the chance or time to discover, we would never have climbed our way to our evacuation. He hauled us up, kicking and punching Vietnamese who were clambering over our bodies. Ashamed and exhausted, we took our turn in the long crowd of refugees inside the embassy compound and waited for the helicopters to come down for us. One by one they came in, landing on an improvised pad in the car park. All had come from American aircraft carriers steaming 20 miles out in the South China Sea. Marines guarded each of the 4 embassy gates as the lucky people ran 30 at a time to their transport to safety. In the first 6 hours of Tuesday, over 1,500 people were airlifted out this way, and almost as many more were still waiting their turn. Our turn came just as it began to get dark, a little after 7:30. Evacuees from the besieged city. And 30 minutes later, we landed safely on our carrier off the South Vietnamese coast.
While Michael, Peter and Hugh joined the thousands of Americans and Vietnamese refugees being evacuated by helicopter, Sandy Gall and his team remained in the city.
These people are waiting, hopefully, but I imagine vainly, for a helicopter to land here on the roof of the American embassy in the middle of Saigon and take them to safety. But they have no papers. They've just come here because the whole embassy is wide open. They've come up the stairs. They're in fact on the chopper pad. No helicopter would probably land under these circumstances.
When the North Vietnamese finally came into Saigon, everyone expected it was going to be like Stalingrad. There'll be street fighting and it will be horrendous. Didn't happen at all. The South Vietnamese army just melted away, and the North Vietnamese just took over.
With the Americans gone and no resistance from the South Vietnamese, Sandy Gall and his crew were there to witness the victorious North Vietnamese forces arrive in Saigon. They seized control of the city and communist rule was complete.
This is a historic moment, the arrival of the North Vietnamese regular army in Saigon, right in the middle of Saigon, just after 12 o'clock, just after noon. Here they are, pouring down the main avenue. Further up there is the American embassy, and at this end of the avenue, is the former presidential palace, which President Chu left just over a week ago, and from which General Min has today announced that he will unconditionally hand over to the new regime. And here they are, arriving in Saigon. This is the presidential palace under new management. There they are, the regular troops of the North Vietnamese army on the balcony. Above them, the flag, the North Vietnamese flag. They are now the new masters.
April the 30th, 1975, marked the end of the Vietnam War. It left a permanent impression on those who covered the conflict and on the people whose lives were forever changed by it.
The South Vietnamese, by the end, felt betrayed. I think that was quite clear, betrayed by the Americans who had been with them since the early 1960s, from political intervention to military involvement. For the United States, it it's a day that in many ways will live in infamy. And I think we saw that again with the fall of Kabul, when the United States gets involved in overseas conflicts and they do not have a clear reason of why they became involved in the first place. They didn't have a sort of politically legitimate reason to get involved in an overseas war. And when they don't have a clear exit plan, I think that's really the legacy of April 30th, 1975.
I think it should be remembered as the culmination of an extraordinary policy failure by the Americans. That the Americans went into Vietnam and pushed on in Vietnam on the basis of a completely false prospectus. That somehow or other, if they didn't stop communism in South Vietnam, it would spread over the whole of Southeast Asia. Well, it's bollocks. And you know, many American men, young men died. Uncounted numbers of Vietnamese died for nothing. That's how I remember it.
I think it's really hard to think what it must have felt like for refugees fleeing. You know, I think there were many who thought this would be a temporary leave, that they would go maybe to neighboring Cambodia, Laos, Thailand, perhaps, and then be able to return to Vietnam. They never thought that they would have to leave the country for good. They didn't know if they, you know, if families were separated, if they would ever see their loved ones again. The Vietnam War was the first televised war. And so even the images caught at the very end of that conflict on April 29th, April 30th, really stayed with the people who saw it at the time in the newspapers, on TV. The images of South Vietnamese civilians trying to scramble to leave along with the Americans who were departing really captures the futility of that war. What they don't capture, of course, is the imminent danger that really faced a lot of these civilians, the smells, the heat of that day.
Looking back on that everything, I remember the smell of the bodies and everything in, you know, trying to get forward to the gates to get out of the embassy. And how difficult it was to be pulled up just by your wrist, you know, one guy who was a massive Marine. I don't know how many people he pulled over, but what a task. And they were trying to get in from every angle. He was sort of kicking people off, and yeah, I never said thank you to him.
The leaders of the new Socialist Republic of Vietnam renamed Saigon Ho Chi Minh City in honor of a revolutionary leader. Over the past 50 years, the city has transformed dramatically. Diplomatic relations between America and Vietnam have been restored, although currently facing turbulent times due to Donald Trump's tariffs and cuts to foreign aid. But the war and its final days in April 1975 have left a lasting legacy, both in the United States and in Vietnam.